Picture this. The world's largest island. We're talking over 2 million square kilometers.
It's a scale that's almost impossible to comprehend.
Exactly. And 80% of it is just buried. Buried under the second largest ice sheet on Earth. And some of that ice is 3 kilometers thick.
It's a landscape from another world, a place where temperatures can just plummet past -50, -70 Celsius, where you have icebergs the size of small cities just calving off into the sea.
It really does sound like the absolute uninhabitable edge of existence.
It does. It feels like the ultimate Arctic frontier, a realm that's just defined by immense cold and this overwhelming isolation. And yet, that brings us to the central paradox of Greenland.
The paradox being that people have actually called this place home.
Not just for a little while, they've managed to thrive there, or at least, survive for over 4,000 years.
4 millennia in that brutal, frozen environment. It's just difficult to fathom. It makes this whole story so much more than just a historical account. It feels like an epic of human ingenuity against these merciless forces of nature.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the narrative is so complex because this isn't one simple continuous culture. It's a story of successive civilizations rising and falling.
Right.
You've got the Paleo-Eskimos, then the Norse, then the later Thule, who are the ancestors of the modern Inuit. Each one rises, adapts, thrives for a time, and then often just collapses. Greenland is a testing ground that demands radical adaptation.
And what immediately captures the imagination for me is that 1,000-year collision point. I mean, imagine standing on a fjord coastline around, say, 1200 CE.
What a scene that would be.
You'd be witnessing 2 radically distinct ways of life coexisting right there at the very limit of the habitable world.
That visual is just stunning. On one side, you've got the Norse farmers, right? They're in their thick, heavy wool, living in these stone and turf longhouses, and they're just struggling desperately to maintain a European-style life.
Trying to raise cattle and sheep where they just shouldn't be.
Exactly. And then right next to them, maybe even in the same fjord system, you have the indigenous Inuit hunters, masters of the sea. They're clad in perfectly tailored sealskin, piloting these sleek kayaks, and they're completely at home in an environment the Norse found, well, lethal.
2 completely alien cultures, defined by utterly different technologies, different beliefs existing side by side. It sets the stage for this incredibly dramatic historical conflict.
And before we even get into that conflict, we have to start with the first great mystery, the one that immediately suggests a degree of, let's say, historical mischief.
The name itself.
The name Greenland.
It sounds like the greatest real estate scam in history. And it was designed by one of its most notorious outlaws.
It was a calculated marketing strategy, plain and simple. We're talking about Erik Thorvaldsson, better known as Erik the Red. And he desperately needed to attract settlers to follow him into this desolate unknown.
So he knew most of it was ice.
Oh, absolutely. He knew the vast majority of the island was perpetually icebound, but he strategically leveraged the few ice-free, grassy fjords in the southwest. The sagas are completely unambiguous on this point.
He called it Greenland, and I'm quoting here, saying that people would be more eager to go there if it had an attractive name.
It's a brilliant piece of psychological manipulation. He knew that these struggling Icelandic farmers would jump at the chance for Greenland, even if the reality was 80% white.
That deception is such a core part of the Norse story, but I think the biggest historical puzzle surrounding this island is really the fate of those settlers.
Exactly. The Norse colony, which at its height housed maybe 5,000 people, simply disappeared.
Gone.
They didn't leave behind final letters. There are no mass graves suggesting some single catastrophic event, and no survivors returned to Europe to tell the tale. For centuries, their sudden and complete vanishing act has been a huge historical enigma.
So our mission is clear then. Before we can even begin to address the vanishing act of the Norse, we have to start at the true beginning. We have to look at the 4,000 years of extraordinary ingenuity and adaptation that preceded Erik the Red. We start with the ice hunters who mastered this environment first.
Let's do a deep dive into the genius of adaptation, beginning with the very first wave of people to conquer the ice.
So our journey begins deep in history, around 2500 BCE. You have these small groups of nomadic people, and they start crossing the frozen strait that separates what we now call Canada and Greenland.
These were the first arrivals, a culture we now call the Saqqaq, and that's named for the site in western Greenland, where their artifacts were first uncovered back in 1948.
The first layer of human tenacity here.
That's a great way to put it. And what sets them apart immediately is their technological sophistication, even though they're only using stone. I mean, these people were not primitive, they were master craftsmen. They were working with incredibly fine materials like silicified slate and this high-quality agate.
I found the details about their tool production just fascinating. They were creating these precise, geometric stone blades known as microliths. How small are we talking, and what were they actually using them for?
We're talking miniature works of art. Some of these blades were no bigger than your fingernail. They didn't use big, bulky stone tools. Instead, they would skillfully have these tiny, razor-sharp microliths into bone or wooden handles.
So they're creating composite tools.
Exactly. And this allowed for incredibly fine work, which was essential for tasks like cutting tough seal skin for clothing or, precisely carving bone tools. This command of stone materials over 4.5 millennia ago, it just speaks to a complete mastery of their resources.
But their survival, it was fundamentally predicated on their relationship with the seal, right? That was their lifeblood.
Everything. Meat, blubber for light and heat, skins for clothing and for boats. To secure this essential, very mobile resource, they needed an innovation that was far beyond just a simple spear.
And that innovation was the toggling harpoon.
This single tool is perhaps the greatest piece of Arctic engineering in history. I mean, think about it. If you use a simple spear, even if you manage to strike a powerful marine mammal, the animal's strength and its movements, especially if it dives, can easily cause that spear to slip right out of the flesh.
And the resource is lost. You've wasted all that energy.
You've lost it. So how did the toggling mechanism defeat that problem? Well, the toggling head wasn't fixed permanently to the shaft. It was attached to the hunter's retrieval line, but it was designed to detach on impact.
Okay, so walk me through this. The hunter throws it.
The Saqqaq hunter thrusts the harpoon head into the seal. The force causes the head to separate from the main shaft. Now, as the seal reacts and tries to swim away, the harpoon head, which is now only connected by the line, rotates a full 90 degrees inside the animal's thick blubber and muscle.
So it becomes an internal anchor, it just gets stuck.
Exactly. It locks itself perpendicular to the line in the direction of the pull. It ensures that the animal cannot escape or break free just by diving. This ingenious mechanical design transformed marine hunting from a risky endeavor into a sustainable practice.
That is the definition of a keystone technology.
Without the toggling harpoon, Saqqaq culture, and likely all the subsequent Arctic cultures, they just would not have been possible.
And this connection to the Arctic environment, it gave us one of the most stunning modern scientific breakthroughs. Because the permafrost is essentially a giant freezer, we actually know what one of these Saqqaq men looked like.
It's an incredible story.
Yeah.
In 2010, scientists achieved this remarkable feat. They sequenced the entire genome from a 4,000-year-old tuft of hair that was found preserved in the permafrost. And the specific details it provided were, well, they were astounding.
So tell us, what did they learn about this individual?
The DNA revealed a man with brown eyes, dark skin, a predisposition toward baldness, and even a specific genetic trait for dry earwax. But the most vital finding for our story of Arctic survival was his metabolic adaptation. His body was genetically optimized to efficiently break down and burn fat. In an environment where the diet was almost exclusively protein and blubber, this was the ultimate evolutionary advantage against the intense cold.
A genetic record of survival, literally written into the ice. And that research also proved conclusively that the Saqqaq were a separate, earlier migration wave from Siberia.
Right, they were distinct from the later Thule people who would become the modern Inuit. They adapted brilliantly, but they weren't the only ones to try and master this land.
No. Following the Saqqaq, around 2400 BCE, we see the rise of the independence cultures. They're named after the northern Independence Fjord, and these people moved into the high Arctic, just a few hundred kilometers from the North Pole itself.
That is survival at the absolute limit. We're talking about enduring 4 straight months of complete winter darkness, average temperatures that regularly plunged past -50 Celsius.
So their survival required a different focus.
It did. While they hunted seals when possible, their primary food source was the massive, shaggy muskoxen. These are true Ice Age survivors. They could handle a cold, but they are formidable opponents.
What kind of hunting techniques would they have used against such powerful beasts?
They likely used the terrain itself as a weapon. They would drive the muskoxen, which tend to huddle up defensively when they're threatened, into geographical traps.
Like a canyon or something.
Exactly. They'd herd them into narrow gullies or deep snowdrifts where their mobility was reduced, and that allowed hunters who were armed with spears and bows to approach and dispatch them more safely. It was a strategy of patience and, spatial awareness.
And this brings us to the famous fire mystery that seems to haunt their archaeological sites.
The Independence campsites show remarkably little evidence of fire. And we're not just talking about a lack of firewood, which was scarce everywhere. This suggests an extreme intentional conservation of all fuel sources.
So how do archaeologists interpret that,
And
this extreme lack of fire?
the prevailing theory is that they ate almost all of their meat raw. Cooking requires precious fuel blubber or dried scraps of wood, and it releases heat that is immediately lost to the environment.
Right.
By consuming meat raw, they preserved every single scrap of available fuel for absolute necessities. Maybe warming tiny living spaces, melting ice for emergency hydration, or lighting a single lamp in the total darkness. It speaks to a level of survival discipline and economic scarcity that is just. It's profound.
It redefines the meaning of making do. But like the Saqqaq before them, the independence culture also vanished around 1800 BCE.
Yes, they just left behind their unique tools and the circles of stones that marked their tent rings. Whether it was a local climate shift, a change in muskoxen migration patterns, or maybe a mysterious disease, we don't know. Their chapter just closed.
Which sets the stage for the third major wave of Paleo-Eskimo adaptation, the Dorset culture, arriving around 500 BCE. If the Saqqaq were the engineers of the hunt, the Dorset were the engineers of warmth.
They certainly were. They were named after Cape Dorset in Canada, and they spread all along Greenland's coasts. Their legacy is really their residential architecture. They moved beyond simple tent rings to build these semi-permanent structures using heavy materials. Stacked stone, sod, and massive whale bones for structural supports.
And their primary technological innovation wasn't a harpoon, but a crucial architectural trick that fundamentally changed how they lived in the cold. You mentioned the cold trap.
Right. The Dorset realized that heat loss in an enclosed space is governed by physics. Warm air rises, cold air sinks. So their houses were built with a long, narrow entrance tunnel. But this tunnel didn't just go straight in, it sloped down into the ground, and then it ramped slightly back up into the main living space.
And what does that specific topography achieve?
It creates a thermal barrier. It's an airlock. The warm air that's generated by lamps or bodies inside the living space, it can't easily escape or rise out through that low entrance. And conversely, the dense cold outside air, which naturally seeks the lowest point, gets trapped in the deep part of the tunnel entrance. It's unable to easily rush up into the heated living area.
That's an incredibly sophisticated, pragmatic application of basic thermodynamics, just to maximize every available degree of heat.
It's a brilliant leap forward in Arctic civil engineering.
So did the Dorset also invent the iconic structure we always associate with the Arctic, the igloo?
They certainly had the tools and the expertise. They developed these incredibly sophisticated snow-cutting techniques using large blades made of bone or stone. And while igloos, being temporary, they don't leave any permanent archaeological traces, historians do credit the Dorset with the skills necessary to master the construction of these snow houses.
And beyond just survival, they were also notable for their art. They left behind these carved figurines, miniature masks, decorated tools. It suggests complex religious or shamanic practices. But what really stands out to me is what archaeologists haven't found, the peaceful puzzle.
In a world defined by scarcity and extreme pressure, this is a genuine anomaly. Their sites yield very few weapons that are specifically designed for war or organized conflict. They certainly hunted, but the infrastructure for violence seems minimal.
Which suggests, what about their society?
It suggests a highly organized cooperative society, one where resource allocation and dispute resolution were managed internally without resorting to frequent violence. They prioritize community survival through technical adaptation over conflict, which is a remarkable trait given the immense challenges they faced.
And despite their longevity spanning centuries, the Dorset were still there when the Norse arrived in 985 CE, and when the Thule, the more aggressive, technologically advanced ancestors of the modern Inuit, arrived around 1200 CE.
But by the 15th century, caught between the intensifying cold and the pressure of these newcomers, the Dorset culture vanished. The Inuit legends remember them as the tunic gentle giants who were strong, but easily frightened away. It's a mournful and poetic close to 4,000 years of brilliant Paleo-Eskimo history.
So the stage is set. For 4,000 years, the Arctic had been mastered by those who bowed to its limits, who adapted to the ice itself. But now the story shifts completely. A different civilization arrives. They're farmers, not hunters, and they're bringing European ambition and, frankly, arrogance to the ice, seeking to defy its limits.
We jump forward dramatically now to 982 CE, and the catalyst for this massive historical shift is one man, Erik Thorvaldsson, known as Erik the Red. His life was just a relentless cycle of violence and exile.
His family history was already checkered, to say the least. His own father was outlawed from Norway for killing a man, which forced the family to settle in Iceland. Erik really did inherit a legacy of lawlessness.
And he certainly perpetuated it in Iceland. The sagas document his feuds, which were essentially blood scores that just spiraled out of control. First, his slaves caused a landslide. When kinsmen killed the slaves in retaliation, Erik took revenge, killing the kinsmen.
But the incident that sealed his fate, the one that led to the discovery of Greenland, involved status symbols, these valuable carved wooden decorative beams.
Yes, he had lent these beams to a neighbor named Thorgest. When Erik demanded them back, Thorgest refused, so Erik forcefully reclaimed them, which led to a savage fight where Thorgest's sons were killed. And that was the line he crossed.
The Icelandic assembly didn't kill him, but they handed down the absolute harshest sentence short of death.
He was sentenced to 3 years of full outlawry. In Viking law, this designated him a wolf's head. This wasn't just being exiled. It meant he was literally outside the protection of the law. He could be hunted and killed by anyone without consequence.
And anyone who helped him was in trouble, too.
Anyone who offered him food, shelter, or aid risks the exact same punishment.
He was a dead man walking if he stayed in Iceland. So his exploration wasn't driven by curiosity or glory, was it? It was just sheer life-or-death necessity. He had to sail west, following these vague, decades-old rumors of land cited by a previous navigator, Gunnbjorn Ulfsson.
It was an act of profound courage, fueled by pure desperation. I mean, imagine sailing over 1,500 kilometers into the North Atlantic void in a longship that's reliant entirely on sail and oars, with no modern instruments. And he knew he had no homeland to return to if he failed.
And his first obstacle was the devastating East Greenland current.
That current is the great natural defense of the island. It sweeps massive icebergs down from the Arctic, making the entire east coast virtually impassable for large ships. His initial failure to land there was predictable, but it forced a brilliant strategic decision.
Instead of giving up, he sails south, around the perilous Cape Farewell, and then up the western coast.
And that side, which is slightly warmed by these stray branches of the Gulf Stream, that was the key. He sailed into these massive fjords that, during the brief summer, were ice-free. And what he found must have been just astonishing to a man expecting utter desolation.
Green meadows.
Green meadows, birch and willow scrub, caribou, seals, walruses.
And the crucial detail for a banished man, it was completely empty of human inhabitants. The Paleo-Eskimo cultures had either retreated or vanished from the area he explored.
So he spent the entirety of his 3 years of outlawry just exploring, mapping, and claiming this territory for himself. That's why the area is littered with names derived from him. Erik's Fjord, Erik's Island, Erik's Home, Erik's Islet. He was establishing a personal claim to a new land.
So when his exile finally ended in 985 CE, he immediately returns to Iceland with one overwhelming goal: recruit settlers. He knew the land was habitable, but he had to convince these struggling Icelandic farmers to undertake this incredibly dangerous journey.
And this is where the famous marketing campaign reached its zenith. He needed to make the gamble sound irresistible. By calling it Greenland, he was deliberately leveraging the few brief, grassy moments against the massive, overwhelming reality of the ice sheet.
And it worked. Erik's pitch, his spin, it struck a chord with those hoping for a better life. The colonization effort he mounted was immense.
It was a true logistical endeavor. His expedition consisted of 25 ships, carrying an estimated 400 to 500 settlers. And crucially, they weren't just bringing people. They brought the entire agricultural infrastructure of their society. Breeding stock of cattle, sheep, goats, horses, pigs, along with seeds, tools, and all their personal belongings.
They were moving an entire civilization. But the North Atlantic, as always, took a devastating toll.
It exacted a terrible price. Only 14 of those 25 ships successfully completed the crossing. Storms, ice, navigational failure. It caused nearly half the fleet to be lost or to simply turn back in despair.
That statistic alone just emphasizes the incredible difficulty and danger involved. So the survivors, the ones who truly believed in Erik's promise, they established their farms, building what would become the eastern and western settlements, and laid the foundation for 3 centuries of precarious European life in the Arctic.
The Norse settlements in Greenland, they represent perhaps the most tenuous grip European civilization has ever held on the extreme edges of the world. Life was just a constant, grueling battle against the elements and scarcity.
So given that climate, how did they adapt their European architecture? What was the fundamental design challenge they faced when they were building those longhouses?
The primary challenge was insulation. They couldn't build with timber. It was basically non-existent, so they adapted. The typical Norse longhouse, maybe 20 meters long, was constructed with these immensely thick walls,
How thick are we talking?
up to 2 meters thick. They were made from heavy stone bases and then topped with thick layers of sod or peat turf. This maximized insulation and minimized the surface area exposed to that lethal cold.
And yet the internal conditions were reportedly miserable.
They were dark, they were cramped, and they were smoky, terribly smoky. They relied on a central hearth for both heat and light. But without the timber resources to build proper flues or chimneys, the smoke had nowhere to go but through gaps in the roof and, inevitably, into the lungs of the inhabitants.
And we actually know the health consequences of that lack of ventilation.
Oh, yes. Archaeological studies on Norse skeletons from the Greenland settlements reveal widespread evidence of chronic smoke inhalation and severe lung damage. They were, quite literally, trading their long-term health for the necessity of immediate, life-saving warmth.
And their need for heat dictated their living arrangements, too. It wasn't just humans crammed together in there.
Exactly. To conserve every calorie of heat, they often kept their most valuable livestock, their dairy cattle and sheep, in an attached barn. It might be separated by a thin wall, or sometimes even in the same structure during the harshest months. They were utilizing the shared body heat of the animals to create a warmer, though certainly less sanitary, communal living space.
And this leads us directly to the fundamental bottleneck of their entire civilization, doesn't it? The fuel crisis and the hay economy. They had virtually no natural timber resources.
The lack of timber was a structural weakness they never overcame. The few birch and willow trees they found were small, scrubby, rarely more than 3 or 4 meters tall, so they were forced into radical fuel adaptation just to survive the winter.
They burned driftwood, which was unreliable. They burned animal bones. And most crucially, they were forced to burn dried animal manure.
The burning of dried animal waste, a practice we know from other cultures facing fuel scarcity. That is the ultimate sign of a community pushed to its environmental limits.
Yeah.
I mean, when you are burning poop for heat, you know nothing is being wasted and desperation is constant.
And yet, they culturally insisted on maintaining cattle. It wasn't just about meat, it was about their identity, and it was about stored calories.
Cattle provided the lifeblood of their stored diet. We're talking cheese, butter, and skyr, that thick, fermented yogurt. These were calories that could be preserved through the entire winter. The centrality of dairy to Norse culture meant they had to keep cattle, even though the animals were so ill-suited to the environment.
And keeping those cattle alive for 7 months, from say October to May, when outside grazing was impossible, that meant that the entire brief 3-month summer was dedicated to one single task:
Haymaking.
haymaking.
The hay economy was the fragile pivot point of their entire existence. They needed massive amounts of hay tons of it, which required enormous fodder storage barns, sometimes even larger than their houses. And this focus created a huge vulnerability.
A single bad summer could wipe them out.
A single, short, wet summer that ruined the hay crop was not just a hardship, it was an existential catastrophe. It would lead to mass starvation of livestock and, inevitably, the human population.
So it wasn't just an economic issue, it was a race against the clock of the growing season. If the summer shortened by just a few weeks, their entire system failed.
Precisely. Their system was rigid. They were Norse farmers trying to survive in an environment that demanded Paleo-Eskimo flexibility. While their sheep were hardier and provided essential wool, the cultural and dietary necessity of dairy kept them dangerously reliant on that hay harvest.
So to maintain this precarious existence, they needed trade with Europe. They had to acquire the things they couldn't produce, like iron for tools and timber for ship and house repairs. What valuable export allowed this tiny colony to maintain these vital trade links with medieval Europe?
Their single most critical luxury export was walrus ivory. Before the Crusades increased access to African elephant tusks, Greenland was Europe's primary source of high-quality ivory.
And this wasn't just a local commodity. This was used for the highest status items across the entire continent.
Indeed. Walrus tusks were used for everything from religious carvings and bishop's croziers to fine jewelry and gaming pieces. A powerful and famous example are the incredible Lewis Jess pieces, which were found in Scotland. Analysis confirms they were almost certainly carved from Greenland walrus ivory. That single trade item connected this remote outpost to the political and wealthy centers of Europe.
And the furs they exported, too, carried immense value, polar bear pelts especially.
Polar bear pelts were incredibly prized. They often functioned as a form of ultra-luxury currency. The sagas even record that one high-quality pelt could literally finance a long-distance pilgrimage, like passage all the way to Rome.
Wow.
They were worn by European royalty as symbols of extreme wealth and status. And even more valuable were live polar bear cubs, which were captured and used as these extraordinary political gifts between kings.
So their trade was based on high-risk hunting for luxury goods, allowing them to import necessities. But their connection to Europe was more than just commerce. It was also defined by faith.
Yes. The Norse had converted to Christianity around 1000 CE. And while Erik the Red himself remained a staunch pagan until his death, his wife Thiodhild converted and immediately built the first church in Greenland.
And within just a generation, the colony was fully integrated into the European Christian structure.
They established their own cathedral and their own bishop, reporting directly back to the Norwegian archdiocese. This just demonstrates their deep commitment to maintaining that European civilization. They required regular shipments of specific religious goods, communion wine, and consecrated bread, which tied them inexorably to the necessity of keeping those transatlantic trade routes open.
A full, albeit precarious, extension of European culture at the edge of the world. And speaking of Erik the Red's family, his son, Leif, would become famous not for staying in Greenland, but for a discovery that was even greater than his father's.
The Norse discovery of North America is a magnificent story, but it began with an almost comical anticlimax.
That would be Bjarni Hurlson, around 1000 CE. He was a pragmatic merchant sailing from Iceland to Greenland who got blown far off course and actually glimpsed a forested, unfamiliar coast.
But he was so focused on finding his father in Greenland, he just corrected his course and continued his mission. He wasn't interested in continental discovery. He was interested in filial duty and business. But his stories, once he arrived in timber-starved Greenland, they were a currency.
And those stories captivated Leif Erikson. Around 1101 CE, motivated by the desperate lack of timber, Leif buys Bjarni's ship and retraces the vague route with 35 men, determined to exploit this new land.
Leif was the true explorer. He meticulously mapped and named the 3 distinct regions he found along the coastline. First, sailing north, he reached Hellu Land, or Flat Stone Land.
Which archaeologists believe is probably Baffin Island.
Exactly. It was barren, rocky, glacier-scoured, and completely useless for their needs. So he rejected it immediately and sailed south, finding Markland, the forest land.
This is almost certainly the Labrador coast, a vast, seemingly endless source of timber. For the Greenland colonists, this was the resource they desperately needed. And yet, Leif sailed on.
He was seeking the fabled land described by the wildest rumors. And eventually, he found Vinland, the ultimate prize, which translates to land of wine.
This brings up the famous grape debate. The sagas describe Vinland as a paradise. Mild winters where livestock could graze year-round, massive salmon, and according to the German crew member Tyrker, wild grapes.
Scholars actually allow Vitis grapes to flourish that far north in Newfoundland or the Gulf of St. Lawrence? Or was the name, like Greenland, just a form of historical exaggeration, with grapes simply referring to abundant wild fruits like cranberries or gooseberries?
Right, a bit of marketing.
Regardless, the description emphasizes a land of plenty, vastly superior to the harsh Greenland environment.
So Leif's expedition spends a winter there. They build temporary shelters, they cut timber, gather goods, and return to Greenland loaded with exactly what they needed.
Their success spurred further attempts. Leif's brother, Thorvald, led the next trip, exploring even further south. And tragically, he became the first European on record to be killed by Native Americans, the Skrælings, as the Norse called the indigenous people, during a skirmish on a beach.
But the largest and most ambitious effort was the Karlsefni colony attempt.
Thorfinn Karlsefni, a wealthy merchant, led over 160 colonists, including women, in a genuine attempt at permanence. They brought their full complement of livestock and gear, and it was here, in Vinland, that Karlsefni's wife, Gudrid, gave birth to Snorri, the first European child born in the Americas.
And the archaeological evidence confirms their serious intent, particularly the discovery at Lonso Meadows.
That 1960 discovery in northern Newfoundland by Helge and Anstein Ingstad proved the sagas were true. They found 8 turf-built structures, bronze pins, iron nails, a spindle whorl for spinning thread, and crucially a specialized forge for smelting bog iron.
Let's focus on that forge for a second. What is bog iron, And why does finding its remnants prove that the Norse were trying to establish a permanent, self-sufficient colony?
Bog iron is iron that precipitates out of stagnant water in bogs, forming these rusty, soft nodules. It's a low-grade ore, but it was essential because there was no bedrock iron to mine in Greenland. The Norse desperately needed iron for nails, for axes, for tools.
And they knew how to process this difficult ore.
They did. So the presence of that specialized forge at Lonesome Meadows, it confirms they weren't just passing through. They were trying to set up a functional, independent industrial base that was capable of sustaining a long-term colony far from the necessary imports of Europe.
So they had the resources, they had the technological know-how, and they had established a foothold. Why did they abandon it after only 3 years?
Initially, they traded successfully with the indigenous people, exchanging red cloth and cow's milk for furs and hides. But that relationship rapidly deteriorated into hostility, likely due to resource competition and, cultural misunderstandings.
And despite the Norse technological advantage iron weapons against stone and bone, they were tactically overwhelmed.
They were vastly outnumbered. Karl Sefny concluded, with brutal pragmatism, that despite the boundless resources, the timber, the land, the grazing, the cost of holding the territory was just too high. So they evacuated the entire colony, abandoning a continent they desperately needed.
That is the profound historical irony, isn't it? The Norse, with their iron axes and their ocean-going ships and their desperate need for wood, they found unlimited timber resources and chose to walk away because it was too dangerous to hold. They retreated back to their precarious existence in Greenland.
And for centuries, this retreat was successful. Trade continued, fueled by walrus ivory. They continued to sail expeditions back to Markland for timber as late as 1347. But unseen, devastating forces, climactic, environmental, and cultural, were already gathering to destroy Erik the Red's fragile dream. #tag outro.
So we have journeyed through 4,000 years of human habitation on the world's largest island. We trace the initial brilliance of the Saqqaq people and their toggling harpoon, the extreme raw survival of the independence cultures, and the clever passive heating engineering of the Dorset's cold trap houses.
And we watched the establishment of a European outpost, the Norse colony, which maintained its tenuous hold on civilization through constant effort, trade, and faith, and even managing to briefly discover and settle North America before retreating back to the familiar, albeit precarious, ice.
But as you pointed out, the structural weakness was always there, that fragile hay economy. Their entire civilization was utterly dependent on a stable, long growing season. And the sources hint at a massive shift. The medieval warm period, which had allowed farming to function, was giving way to the catastrophic Little Ice Age.
And this shift meant the fjords packed with ice earlier, cutting off vital shipping lanes. Critically for the Norse, the growing season shortened by weeks, which pushed that hay economy past its breaking point. And just as the climate worsened, a powerful new rival arrived from the west.
The Thule people.
The Thule people, the ancestors of the modern Inuit.
And we know that they were technologically and culturally superior at surviving the deep cold than the Norse ever were.
Their story is the ultimate answer to the Norse Vanishing Act. But let's leave you with this final, provocative thought to mull over as we prepare to explore the final chapter of Norse Greenland.
Go on.
The Viking farmers had every European advantage: iron tools, sophisticated ships, advanced agricultural knowledge. Yet they failed and vanished. Meanwhile, the indigenous Thule people, using only bone and stone tools, not only survived the worsening cold, but thrived.
So what specific set of cultural adaptations, which focused entirely on hunting and sea resources rather than agriculture, allowed the indigenous ice hunters to succeed in Greenland, where the Viking farmers, with all their material advantages, ultimately failed? That is the profound cultural and environmental mystery that awaits you in the next deep dive.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take the largest, most fascinating stack of historical sources, scientific data, and archaeological findings and distill it down to the essential, earth-shattering facts you need to know. Today, we are undertaking a monumental task. We're trying to solve one of history's most enduring and, well, melancholy mysteries.
We are sailing to the absolute edge of the known world, traveling 400 years into the past to tackle the saga of Norse Greenland. This was a thriving European society, established by Erik the Red in the late 10th century, that had farms, international trade, religious structures, and it simply vanished.
The paradox is what draws you in, isn't it?
Yeah.
We're talking about a group of people who managed to colonize the Arctic for 4 centuries.
400 years. It's an incredible length of time.
And they were Christian, fiercely tied culturally and politically to Norway, to Rome. Yet sometime between 1408 and 1500, they disappeared so thoroughly that when the next European ships returned centuries later, all they found were crumbling stone ruins and silence.
Our mission today is to conduct a forensic deep dive. We're looking at environmental history, cultural psychology, and the ultimate test of human adaptation. We're searching for the precise convergence of factors that caused a complete, total societal collapse.
It's not just a story of decline. It's a story of total documented silence. How could a fully networked European colony, complete with bishops and cathedrals, disappear more completely than civilizations like the Mayans or even the Roman Empire?
Exactly. They had a lifeline, they had technology, and yet they evaporated. That is the historical puzzle we have to solve for you today.
So to understand the fall, we have to start with the rise. We have to understand the height of their prosperity. For 4 centuries, the Norse didn't just survive in Greenland. They established a fully functioning, prosperous European society. And the foundation of that success, we find, was sheer unexpected climate luck.
Indeed. When the Norse arrived, following Erik the Red's banishment from Iceland around 985 CE, they hit the climate lottery. They arrived precisely at the start of what we now call the medieval warm period, which spanned roughly from 900 to 1300 CE.
Now, when we talk about global temperature shifts, 1 degree Celsius sounds marginal. Why was that 1 degree so transformative in the high Arctic? What were the practical, day-to-day implications of that warming?
It was anything but marginal at that latitude. During the medieval warm period, the northern hemisphere was maybe 1 to 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer than the centuries that came after. In Greenland, that warmth manifested as a crucial retreat of the Arctic sea ice.
So we're talking about open water, where there would usually be perpetual ice.
Precisely. Waters that were normally frozen for much of the year became navigable for longer periods. And crucially, the sailing season from Europe to Greenland, which was always a hazardous journey, it lengthened dramatically.
Right, so instead of a tiny window of just a few weeks in high summer.
They might have had several months where transport was feasible. This extended lifeline was absolutely critical for them to maintain that European cultural identity.
And what about on the land itself? How did that warming affect agriculture in a region that's, constantly battling permafrost and glaciers?
Well, the glaciers pulled back significantly from the coastal fjords where they built their settlements. This exposed more land for grazing. But the real game changer, the thing that was essential for their entire agrarian system, was the extension of the growing season for hay.
Ah, for the livestock.
Exactly. We're talking about 3 or 4 additional weeks of crucial growth time. That determined whether their livestock survived the long, dark winter.
So Erik the Red's infamous marketing ploy, calling this desolate, icy land Greenland, for a short window of time, it was surprisingly true. They were just incredibly lucky with their timing.
Absolutely. They established their colonies, the larger eastern settlement in the southwest and the smaller western settlement further north on land that was experiencing the most clement, the most favorable climate window in its recent history. They built a European agricultural society in a place that could only temporarily sustain it.
Okay, let's move forward to the peak of their society around 1200 CE. This wasn't just a temporary fishing camp. This was a fully functioning, culturally European state.
It really was. The Eastern Settlement, which is in the modern-day Kokortok area, was a major population center. We estimate around 190 farms in the Eastern Settlement alone. The total population across both colonies could have reached 5,000 people. They weren't just farmers, they had laws, they had courts, a political structure, and a really sophisticated infrastructure.
And the most visible evidence of this commitment to their European identity had to be the massive religious infrastructure they built.
Without a doubt. They built 14 stone churches in a land that is utterly devoid of structural timber. I mean, think about that. They had to drag these massive stones for miles sometimes to the building sites.
And the centerpiece was the cathedral at Gardar, the seat of the bishop.
Yes, and this wasn't some simple chapel. It was a complex structure that required a massive societal effort to construct and maintain. They even established a Benedictine monastery and an Augustinian nunnery, which demonstrates a deep, costly, and resource-intensive commitment to the medieval Catholic hierarchy.
This level of infrastructure, it just speaks to a thriving economy and a close connection to the wider world of Christendom. They weren't just isolated Norse settlers, they were part of the global system.
They were deeply integrated. From 1124, they were officially part of the Norwegian Archdiocese of Nidaros. The Bishop of Gardar was a figure of immense local power, often the largest landowner, and their integration was financial. They paid tithes directly to Rome.
And those ties weren't paid in, what, local produce? They were paid in the most exotic luxury goods the Arctic could possibly provide.
Precisely. Walrus ivory, polar bear furs, and prized gerfalcons. Just think about the logistical nightmare of this tax payment. You have these goods walrus tusks, which might weigh 20 pounds each, traveling from the northern hunting grounds south to the settlements, then across the dangerous North Atlantic, through Norway, across all of Europe to end up in the Vatican.
There's that striking anecdote, the record of a live polar bear being sent as a gift to the Pope. That single action just encapsulates the sheer audacity of this colony's global reach.
It really does. It demonstrates that Greenland was seen and saw itself as a valued, if eccentric, partner in the European sphere. They were exporting these high-value, high-status items that cemented their political and religious position despite their geographical isolation.
And that entire system only worked because of the trade network. Ships arrived annually from Norway, bringing essentials that simply could not be produced locally.
Right. They imported critical structural materials. They needed iron for tools, for weapons, for farming implements, since they had no local source for smelting. They needed timber for major construction and ship repairs, as Greenland only offered dwarf willow and shrubbery.
And the imports went right to the heart of their cultural and religious identity.
Absolutely. They imported grain for bread, malt for brewing beer, and critically, communion wine and wafers. This isn't just about sustenance, it's about social status and religious necessity. To be Norse was to be Christian, and to maintain the sacrament required imports. If those ships stopped coming, their very identity was scanned.
And in return, they offered walrus ivory, the backbone of their entire existence.
Walrus ivory by the ton. The Norse learned to hunt walrus very efficiently, for both the tusks and the hides. The hides were cut into this tough, durable rope, prized for ship rigging all across Europe. They also exported seal and polar bear furs, Arctic fox pelts, and of course those magnificent white gerfalcons, which were considered major status symbols for medieval nobility.
The scale of this ivory trade is just remarkable. This wasn't a niche product. It was a key commodity in Europe for centuries.
It was. For the 11th and 12th centuries, Greenland provided the vast majority of Europe's ivory needs. Archaeologists have found artifacts made from Greenland walrus, ivory chess pieces, croziers, carved reliquaries in places as distant as Constantinople and Rome. This remote colony was not peripheral, it was a critical supplier for the medieval luxury market.
But despite all this prosperity, you mentioned earlier the inherent precarity. The entire structure was built on a knife edge.
The margin of error was, well, terrifyingly thin. Every single farm was, at its heart, a hay farm. They measured their entire year's success by the volume of fodder they could stockpile to feed their cattle through the deep, dark winter. If they had a bad hay season because of a sudden cold snap or persistent rain, the consequences were existential.
Which led to impossible, agonizing choices.
Indeed. If the fodder ran out early, they faced immediate starvation. They had to decide. Do we eat the dairy cows now to survive the week, knowing that reduces milk production and the number of calves next year? Or, even worse, do we eat the breeding stock? The constant choice was between preventing present starvation versus guaranteeing future collapse.
This economic ambition, this constant need for ivory, it pushed the Norse into extreme geographical hardship, which we see with the Nordsitter expeditions.
The Nordsitter, yes, the northern hunting grounds. They were absolutely crucial. These were ambitious summer hunting parties that traveled north for hundreds of kilometers, often sailing into the treacherous waters around Disco Bay and even beyond. If the ivory trade was the engine of their economy, the Nordsitter was the oil pump.
And how far north did they actually get? We have physical proof of their expansion, right?
We do. We have archaeological evidence near Upernivik, which is an astounding 700 kilometers north of the main settlements. They left behind elaborate stone cairns, temporary shelters, and even sophisticated stone bear traps designed to capture polar bears for their valuable furs.
And the ultimate physical proof, the runestone.
That's right. A runestone was discovered near Upernivik, inscribed with names and a date from the medieval period. It's definitive proof that Norse hunters were pushing that far north, sacrificing safety and convenience for the sake of this luxury economy. The desire for walrus ivory and polar bear pelts was literally driving them to the geographical limits of the known Arctic world.
But this ambition, it foreshadows their fall. That crucial political move in 1261, the formal submission to the Norwegian king, was purely about guaranteeing economic security.
Exactly. They traded their political autonomy for a solemn promise. Norway guaranteed that at least one ship would sail to Greenland every year. They understood, even at their peak, just how precarious that lifeline was. and they were willing to give up independence for a contractual guarantee of imports.
So at the very height of their prosperity, they recognized their own fragility and locked themselves into an economic contract that would soon be brutally tested by nature.
The 13th century was their golden age churches, tithes, ivory, royal protection. But the climate, which had initially smiled upon them, was already beginning to turn against them.
Around 1300 CE, those 4 centuries of climate luck just ran out. The climate reversal we called the Little Ice Age began. And for the Norse in Greenland, this wasn't a sudden crisis. It was the start of a slow-motion, relentless catastrophe.
The Little Ice Age was a multi-century period, generally lasting until the mid-19th century, where global mean temperatures dropped. In the North Atlantic region, this meant a decrease of perhaps 1 to 2 degrees on average. But as historians of environmental change always remind us, the average doesn't tell the whole story.
The unpredictability must have been the true killer for an agricultural society like theirs.
It was. The variability became extreme. Winters were harsher, longer, and much less predictable. A late spring frost could devastate early growth. Summer shortened dramatically, shaving crucial weeks off that hay-growing season. For the Norse, whose entire survival depended on a few weeks of intensive agricultural labor, this was devastating.
And the consequences were felt almost immediately in the smaller, more exposed colony.
The Western settlement, yes. Being situated further north and exposed to harsher conditions, it was the first domino to fall. By the 1300s, farms there began to be abandoned systematically. Families either tried to consolidate onto more sheltered plots of land or, crucially, migrated south to the eastern settlement.
This abandonment signaled a clear early warning that the European agricultural model was no longer sustainable in the Arctic.
It was the system breaking down, farm by farm. The cold was literally eating away at their margin of error, forcing painful social choices and revealing the fundamental flaw in their entire settlement strategy.
Which brings us to this profound historical frustration. Why didn't they adapt? The conditions worsened, they saw their neighbors struggling, yet the archaeological record suggests they clung stubbornly to the old way of life.
This is the centerpiece of the whole mystery: cultural rigidity. We see evidence that they continued raising cattle, even as the necessary fodder became impossibly scarce. They prioritized their livestock over their own bellies, trying desperately to maintain the social structure that was built on cattle ownership.
They prioritized cultural continuity over survival. They kept trying to be farmers when the Arctic was actively telling them that farming was fatal.
And this rigidity extended to hunting. While the seas were full of cod and seals, they did not significantly alter their diet until it was almost too late. Most strikingly, they refused to adopt the highly advanced, proven Arctic survival techniques of the Thule Inuit, the indigenous people who were thriving right alongside them.
Let's really dissect this resistance. Why was Norse identity so inextricably tied to cattle and hay that they might prefer starvation to change?
Their entire worldview was built around being Christian European farmers. Their concept of wealth, their status, their community, it all hinged on livestock. To abandon this for seal hunting, especially hunting from a kayak, eating raw marine mammal products, it was perceived as reverting to savagery.
And the term they used for the indigenous people they encountered, the Inuit, was skraeling.
Correct, a derogatory term loaded with contempt. For the Norse, the psychological cost of adopting skraeling work would have meant giving up their entire European Christian identity. They saw themselves as superior Europeans, a link in the chain of Christendom. To compromise that identity, even for physical survival, was perhaps psychologically impossible for the culture as a whole. They may have collectively chosen what they saw as a noble death as Fjormers over a degrading survival as Arctic hunters.
And this sets up the most incredible irony. The Thule Inuit ascendancy happened at the exact same time as the Norse decline. They were moving into Greenland just as the climate was turning against the Europeans.
Exactly. The Thule Inuit arrived in Greenland around 1200 CE, right as that cooling trend began. But for the Thule, who had migrated across the high Arctic, the Little Ice Age was, in many ways, an advantage.
How does cooling help a civilization survive in the Arctic? That seems so counterintuitive.
The advancing sea ice and the shifting currents actually pushed more marine mammals, especially seals and whales, closer to the coastal hunting grounds where the Thule lived. The very environment that was squeezing the Norse farmer was creating an abundance for the Thule hunter.
And the Thule brought with them the ultimate Arctic survival kit, technology that had been perfected over millennia.
They were masters of the environment because they had engineered solutions for every single challenge the Arctic presented. Their specialized technology included the incredibly fast, agile kayaks for seal hunting and the large, robust umiak skin boats capable of carrying massive whale hunting parties or moving entire families and all their possessions.
And their mastery of winter travel and shelter must have been critical differentiators.
Absolutely essential. They used efficient dog sleds for crossing long stretches of stable sea ice. And their housing strategy was perfectly adapted. They built igloos, temporary, highly effective shelters constructed from the most abundant material in winter snow. Their diet was exclusively marine mammals, providing the necessary fat and caloric density to thrive, not just survive, in that extreme cold.
It's a profound contrast. The Inuit culture had an answer for every environmental challenge because their life was designed by the Arctic, while the Norse only had European expectations.
That is the core conflict of the story, and as the climate deepened the cold, the external forces aligned against the Norse, leading to a rapid economic collapse and profound isolation.
The shipping crisis was the physical manifestation of that isolation.
As the pack ice advanced and the sea lanes became perpetually choked, the supply ships struggled or simply failed to make the journey. That guaranteed annual ship promised by the Norwegian king in 1261, it often didn't materialize. No ship meant no iron, no timber, no grain, and no religious supplies.
The consequences of losing those imports must have been crippling beyond measure.
Oh, think about the practicalities. How do you repair a ship without iron nails? How do you forge new tools without imported ore? How do you keep up morale without the symbolic connection of the communion wine? This led to the rapid material decay of the colony. We find evidence of the Norse desperately trying to rework scrap metal and even reusing grave fittings just to maintain functional tools.
And that connection to the church, it just evaporated, a huge social and political loss.
It was fatal to their identity. The last record of any bishop actually residing in Gardar is from 1378. The diocese technically existed on paper, but the office was left unfilled for decades. Their spiritual and high-level social connection to Europe was severed. They became orphans of Christendom.
And at the very same time, the engine that had funded their entire venture seized up completely. The ivory market crash.
This was the final brutal blow delivered by the global economy, completely unrelated to the climate change that was killing them physically. By the 14th century, Portuguese traders had opened direct access to West African ports, bringing vast quantities of elephant ivory into Europe.
How did elephant ivory compare to walrus ivory?
It was superior in almost every way for carving. Elephant tusks were larger, they offered a higher quality material, and they were often cheaper and easier to transport than a walrus tusks hauled all the way from the Arctic. Greenland's prime export, the backbone of their entire economic system, became instantly worthless in the European market. Their value proposition just collapsed overnight.
So environmental doom and a simultaneous unpreventable economic catastrophe.
A truly disastrous convergence. And the first large-scale symptom of this was the vanishing of the Western settlement around 1350, which remains one of the most haunting passages in all the sources.
The first mystery. The account comes from a priest, Ivar Bardarson. Describe what he found.
Bardarson, traveling from the eastern settlement, arrived at the western settlement expecting to find a functioning, if struggling, colony. Instead, he found complete silence. The farms were empty, the houses were standing, but they were abandoned.
And what makes this so mysterious is the lack of evidence of any disaster.
There were no signs of violence, no burning, and crucially, no bodies. The only living things were the livestock cattle running feral in the fields. A community of perhaps 500 people had simply disappeared.
Which leaves us with this unanswerable question. Did they migrate en masse south to the eastern settlement, leaving no record? Were they somehow secretly absorbed by the Inuit? Did an epidemic wipe them out and leave no mass graves?
It is a dark, unanswerable question that remains a haunting prefiguration. The western settlement was gone, and within a century, the exact same fate would consume the eastern settlement as well.
So now we move to the ultimate silence. The last verifiable written record of any European contact is the 1408 wedding of Thorstein Olafsson and Sigrid Bjornsdottir.
The location was Folsey Church, which is the best preserved ruin in the eastern settlement today. Icelandic guests actually attended and even left behind detailed records of the ceremony, noting the usual customs and solemnity.
So they documented a normal, if remote, wedding, entirely unaware they were recording the final public act of European Greenland's history, and then the void.
Sometime between that wedding in 1408 and 1500, the eastern settlement ceased to exist. When the next generations of European explorers returned, often blown off course, just stumbling upon the ruins, they found silence. No final messages carved into stone, no mass burials, no survivors to relay the tale. The Norse vanished more completely than any other European civilization.
Sheer lack of evidence is the shock. It confirms that this wasn't a sudden catastrophe, but something far more drawn out and complex.
The architecture of their European identity, the stone churches, the farm ruins, it all remained, but the people were gone. To solve this, we really have to dedicate some time to the 5 major competing theories of collapse and analyze why each one fails or succeeds as a sole explanation.
Okay, let's start with the most obvious factor. Theory 1. Pure climate collapse. The Little Ice Age was a slow-motion disaster.
The data is undeniable. Hay yields likely dropped by 50% or more over a century. The glaciers advanced. The coastal fjords choked with ice. This was a slow strangulation via starvation and exposure. The environment killed them.
But the critique of this theory is fundamental to archaeology, isn't it? Humans die and they leave remains. If 5,000 people starve to death over a generation, why don't we find mass graves or widespread skeletal evidence suggesting famine?
Exactly. Climate stress was a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. It merely lowered the carrying capacity of the land. If climate was the sole factor, we should find bodies scattered across the landscape or concentrated in burial sites, which we just do not. It explains the cause of the struggle, but not the mechanism of the disappearance.
Okay, Theory 2 introduces a human element, conflict with the Thule Inuit. As resources shrank because of the Little Ice Age, competition for seals and hunting grounds intensified. Did the Inuit wipe them out?
This is a plausible component. We know the Inuit spread throughout the coastal regions by the 15th century, but it's very unlikely to be the sole factor for the total disappearance. The Norse, though weakened, still possessed superior weapon technology, iron axes, spears, chainmail, and they had defended stone positions.
And if there had been a decisive military campaign, wouldn't we find evidence of battle sites?
Yes, or mass graves detailing violent, unnatural death. What we lack are conclusive, large-scale archaeological proofs of a protracted war or a final massacre. While violence certainly occurred, and the Inuit oral histories confirm revenge raids, it seems unlikely that the Inuit, who were focused on resource acquisition, would systematically hunt down every single remaining Norse person.
All right, moving to Theory 3, epidemic disease. Did the Black Death, which ravaged Europe in the mid-14th century, reach the colony on one of those increasingly rare supply ships?
Isolated populations like Greenland are profoundly vulnerable to introduced pathogens. A sudden epidemic could have decimated a third or even half the population. But the timing is complex. The Black Death peaked in Europe around 1347-1351. By that time, trade with Greenland was already tenuous at best.
And once again, the lack of evidence is the problem.
We don't have any records of plague or any traditional signs of an epidemic, like mass graves. If an epidemic occurred, it likely would have been a smaller, localized disease that just finished off an already starting and dispersed population, rather than a massive, singular event that erased the whole society.
Theory 4 is the quietest one. It suggests an unrecorded economic abandonment. Greenland became economically worthless when the ivory market crashed and the climate worsened.
This theory argues for a gradual, decades-long decline. The ship stopped coming because there was simply no profit in the venture. Faced with relentless cold and a collapsing social structure, the young, the healthy, and the strong simply left. They boarded the occasional ship that might dock in Iceland or Norway, looking for a better life.
So the population didn't die suddenly, it just withered away.
Exactly. This explains the lack of mass graves and the lack of violence. If a population of 5,000 dwindles slowly over a century to just a few hundred elderly, non-reproducing individuals, those last few might simply perish in their homes or fields without creating a definitive archaeological event. The colony died of old age and emigration.
Which brings us to Theory 5, and this one deals with cultural psychology, cultural suicide.
This is perhaps the darkest, most profound option. The idea that their refusal to abandon their European farming identity, the refusal to become Skraeling, was a conscious or subconscious choice of death over cultural compromise.
Wait, if they were facing death by starvation, wouldn't the primal biological instinct for survival override cultural taboos about eating seal blubber or adopting Inuit technology?
That's what we'd assume today. But history is littered with examples where identity proves more resilient than biology. Sociologists suggest that for the Norse, their identity was their survival, politically and spiritually. If they abandoned cattle and farming, they ceased to be Norse in the eyes of Europe, and maybe in their own eyes. To live like the Inuit would have meant forfeiting their soul, their class, and their connection to Christendom. They held on to their identity until they died of malnutrition, which we can actually prove archaeologically.
So what does modern unified scholarship suggest, drawing on all these possibilities?
The modern consensus really favors a perfect storm, a catastrophic convergence. Climate stress weakened them severely over decades. Economic collapse cut their European lifeline. Cultural rigidity blocked the only viable adaptation strategy, and the population dwindled slowly through emigration, localized disease, and starvation, eventually resulting in the complete void we find today.
And the archaeological truth of their final years, it confirms the desperate struggle imposed by that cultural rigidity.
Yes, the analysis of human remains from the final Norse burials is definitive proof of their terminal suffering. The bones show severe signs of malnutrition, specifically pitted lesions that indicate critical vitamin deficiencies. They were starving.
And yet, they resisted adaptation until it was far too late.
They did. That same bone analysis shows that in their final decades, they had finally increased their consumption of seal meat, suggesting a reluctant last-ditch attempt to abandon their food taboos. But the cultural shift came far too late, and they never mastered the specialized hunting required to make a seal-based diet sustainable through the deep winter.
The ultimate silence on this is best captured by the Inuit perspective, who watched this whole strange drama unfold.
They called the Norse the Kavnunate, the foreigners. Their oral histories remember them as tall, blonde strangers who tried to impose their will on the land. When the Inuit look back, their history doesn't record a decisive victory, but rather that the foreigners were simply not there anymore. It's a profoundly haunting and understated conclusion to 4 centuries of European colonization.
While the Norse saga is one of failure to adapt and cultural rigidity, the contemporary story of the Thule Inuit is one of triumphant mastery over the most unforgiving environment on Earth.
The Thule migration story is one of the most remarkable population movements in human history. They migrated a staggering 4,500 kilometers across the top of the world, starting in Alaska, moving across Canada, and finally establishing themselves in Greenland right around 1200 CE.
What was the primary driving force behind that immense multi-generational journey?
They followed the bowhead whale. The Thule were arguably the most sophisticated pre-industrial whaling culture ever developed. Their entire society, their technology, their art, their social structure, it was all built around the ability to hunt, process, and utilize these massive marine mammals.
So detail their whaling technology. Hunting a bowhead whale, an animal that weighs 60 tons from a small skin boat, just sounds like an impossible feat of engineering and courage.
It required specialized cooperation and truly ingenious engineering. The Thule relied on the large umiaks, or women's boats, which were large, open skin boats capable of carrying 8 to 12 paddlers. But the crucial technology was the toggling harpoon.
How did the toggling harpoon work?
Unlike a simple spear, the head of the harpoon was designed to detach upon impact and then turn sideways, or toggle under the skin of the whale. This harpoon head was attached to a long line that was secured to multiple inflated sealskin floats.
So the floats served multiple purposes.
They were absolutely essential. They prevented the whale from sounding or diving deep. They created massive drag, exhausting the animal until it had to surface for air. Once it was exhausted, multiple boats could approach to finish the kill with lances. Successful whaling captains were the true aristocrats of Thule society, ensuring the survival of their community through the abundance of meat, oil, and bone they provided.
And beyond whaling, they possessed a complete Arctic toolkit, a perfect answer for every single environmental challenge.
An utterly comprehensive and successful suite of tools. We're talking about the specialized kayaks for fast seal hunting, the umiak for transport, dog sleds for efficient travel over stable sea ice, the snow knife for building igloos from the abundant snow, the efficient ulu knife for butchering, and even waterproof clothing crafted from stitched seal intestines.
If the Norse were rigid, the Thule were the absolute epitome of flexibility. That has to be the key differentiator between the two cultures.
It is the ultimate lesson. The Thule were mobile. They did not attempt to impose permanent agriculture or fixed settlements on the land. They adapted their entire life, their location, their diet, their hunting methods, to the dictates of the seasons, the ice, and the migratory animals.
Whereas the Norse were trying to replicate a small European farming community, regardless of the latitude they were at.
Exactly. The Norse attempted to impose a foreign European model of life that demanded the Arctic cooperate. The Thule, in contrast, allowed the Arctic environment to dictate their entire strategy for survival. One culture was resilient because it moved. The other was rigid and fought the inevitable.
We know these two very different worlds met, The evidence of intercultural contact is extensive, even if it's, well, archaeologically asymmetric.
We find considerable evidence of Norse material in Thule sites, scraps of iron knife blades, chainmail links, woolen fabric, copper fragments spread across hundreds of kilometers. This proves trade occurred, likely in an effort to acquire valuable iron and metal that the Thule lacked.
The Thule clearly valued the Norse metal highly, often reworking scrap iron into their own specialized tools.
They absolutely did. Iron was a rare and precious resource, but the reverse is much less common. We find very little Inuit material in Norse sites.
What does that asymmetry suggest about the Norse perspective on things?
It strongly suggests Norse caution, perhaps even disdain, and a general lack of interest in incorporating Inuit materials or technologies into their European lifestyle. The Inuit wanted Norse metal. The Norse may not have seen anything the Inuit possessed, their bone tools, their skin clothing, as superior to or even equal to their own dwindling European imports.
And the Norse textual accounts, they confirm they were aware of the Inuit, but they were wary.
The sagas mention the Skraelings, describing dangerous encounters and conflicts over hunting territories. The 13th century educational text, The King's Mirror, described them in detail, small stature, using stone and tusk rather than iron. They were known, but they were treated as an exotic curiosity and a threat, not as a model for adaptation.
And the Inuit side of the story, told through oral histories, details how that relationship shifted over time.
Yes, legends collected by later Danish missionaries describe the Kablunate, the foreigners. Early stories detail peaceful coexistence, sometimes trade. But as resources tightened due to the Little Ice Age and the Norse struggled, the relationship rapidly deteriorated into competition and finally into conflict.
Including stories of revenge and the final conflict that potentially wiped out a settlement.
Yes. While it's unverified archaeologically, these stories recount conflicts escalating from simple raids to brutal revenge actions, suggesting that as the Norse population weakened, they became vulnerable to groups who understood the land and held numerical superiority.
But the ultimate environmental verdict remains clear. The real contest was not physical or military, but ideological.
Absolutely. The competition was between the two ways of life and the unforgiving, dynamically changing Arctic environment. The Thule's flexible, fully adapted culture won by default because it was the only one that could withstand the climate rules of the Little Ice Age.
And the ultimate confirmation of that triumph came centuries later.
When the Danes returned in force in 1721, they found no trace of the Norse. But they found a vibrant, successful Thule Inuit population, estimated at about 10,000, living all across the coasts. A powerful, successful culture that had completely mastered the environment that had defeated the Europeans.
So when we put it all together, what does this all mean?
When we synthesize the story of Norse Greenland, the disappearance wasn't due to a single cataclysmic event. It was a fatal convergence of three non-negotiable forces: persistent climate change, devastating economic isolation, and the most crucial internal factor crippling cultural rigidity. They survived 4 centuries of harshness, but they could not survive the simultaneous loss of their economic lifeline and their stubborn refusal to let go of who they thought they were.
It is a profound and I think a melancholy human lesson for us today. The environment always sets the rules for survival. The deepest threat isn't always the storm outside, but the inability to let go of the rigid identity that you bring with you.
Right.
The Norse were undone because their definition of civilization built on cattle, churches, and imported grain simply could not withstand the reality of the Little Ice Age.
Their identity demanded they be farmers and cattle raisers, and that demand proved fatal in a land that required them to be marine mammal hunters.
The source material ends by forcing us to consider the profound modern irony inherent in this story. The Norse perished because the climate cooled.
Today, the descendants of the thriving Thule Inuit face an existential threat from the exact opposite direction. Global warming is dramatically reshaping their environment, melting sea ice, changing marine mammal migratory patterns, and threatening their hunting culture faster than anything the Norse ever experienced.
So if the Norse died because they refused to abandon their European farming identity, what cultural traditions, what deep-seated identity must the resilient Thule Inuit sacrifice now to survive a warming world? That's the complex question this deep dive leaves you to mull over until next time.
When you look at a map, Greenland is, well, it's usually just this enormous ice-covered white blob at the very top of the world.
Yeah, the visual definition of isolation, right?
Yeah.
Of remote wilderness.
Exactly. A place you think of only in terms of, I don't know, polar bears and just silence.
And that image, while, geographically it's accurate, it's also so misleading.
Hmm.
Politically and historically, it couldn't be more wrong.
How so?
Because that very island, that frozen wasteland, as it was dismissively called for centuries, has actually been central to global power
Well,
struggles.
not just recently.
No, for a long time. Superpower conflicts. And now it's at the heart of the defining crisis of our time, climate change.
Okay, let's unpack this. So we're not talking about some distant, inconsequential landmass.
Not at all. We are diving into an island of really spectacular extremes, a place where that geographical isolation gave way over the course of maybe a single generation to massive global consequence.
So our mission today is to take you on a deep dive through that transformation. We're going to trace the line from, the desperate attempts of early missionaries all the way to
Secret nuclear infrastructure that is literally melting out of the ice as we speak.
And it all leads to a nation that's fighting for its independence while the ground is, disappearing right from under its feet.
It's an incredible story. We've pulled together sources that cover centuries of history, from the first colonization efforts in the 1700s through 2 world wars, the paranoia of the Cold War, and now this frantic race for resource control.
We're going to connect the dots between an obsessed Lutheran pastor, Hans Egede, and the modern-day politicians who are debating how to fund a new nation with minerals.
And here's the core paradox you need to keep in mind as we go through this.
This is the thing that frames the entire story.
It is. The catastrophic global change, the climate change melting the ice sheet, is at the same time the single greatest potential source of funding for Greenland's push for independence.
The threat to global civilization is their path to freedom.
Exactly. It's a staggering dilemma.
To really understand where Greenland is today, we have to go back, not to the Vikings, they were long gone, but to the dramatic return of Europeans in the 18th century.
Right. By 1700, the Norse had vanished. The Inuit were the sole inhabitants. So the European return was driven by colonization, yes, but it all started with this almost unbelievably specific religious delusion.
A delusion that belonged to one man.
One man, Hans Egede. He was a Norwegian-Danish Lutheran minister. And his mission was not just general evangelism. He was absolutely convinced of something very specific.
What was it?
He was convinced that the medieval Norse Greenlanders, who had settled the south hundreds of years before, were still out there,
Frightened.
isolated. He believed they were still practicing the Catholic faith and were therefore in desperate need of a Protestant salvation after the Reformation.
You have to think about the sheer focus of that obsession. He wasn't worried about the people who were actually there.
Not at all.
Yeah.
He was obsessed with this lost tribe of possibly Catholic Vikings who had no idea Martin Luther even existed, and he felt divinely compelled to go save their souls.
And he spent years, decades even, trying to convince the Danish crown.
It must have been an incredible act of persuasion. He had to convince the king to fund this huge maritime expedition to a place everyone else just dismissed as a frozen wasteland.
And nobody believed him.
Nobody believed these Norse people were still alive, but age's religious certainty somehow won out. In 1721, he finally arrived with a small group and set up his first settlement near modern-day Nuuk.
So he gets there, he sets up shop, all excited to find his lost Catholic Norsemen. And what does he actually find?
He finds exactly what everyone else expected him to find.
Ruins.
Ruins of the old Norse farms and, more importantly, a thriving, adaptable Inuit population.
So his whole mission was a bust from the start.
It should have been. But Egede, for all his initial rigidity, proved to be highly adaptable.
Yeah.
The goal just pivoted instantly.
Okay, so if he can't save lost Christian Vikings.
Then he'll focus on converting the Inuit pagans.
And this is where we get that fantastic anecdote about the early linguistic barriers, right? It just shows how hard it was to bridge that cultural chasm.
The chasm was enormous, linguistically, culturally. I mean, he's trying to explain these core theological concepts, eternal life, salvation, to people whose entire view of the world was completely different.
And in one of his first sermons, he tries to explain eternal life through Jesus.
He does. But the translation?
It's a little lost.
Hilariously lost. The words he used for salvation and eternal fulfillment came across to his Inuit listeners as something like, Jesus will stuff you so full of food that you will never, ever be hungry again.
I mean, in a harsh Arctic environment, that's the ultimate promise.
You can see the appeal. That perpetual caloric satisfaction probably grabbed more attention than any talk of spiritual grace.
I'd imagine so.
But it just highlights that profound cultural distance. Still, despite those early failures, Egede and his son Paul, they kept at it.
And his son became a gifted linguist.
Truly gifted. Their work translating religious texts and dictionaries, it resulted in the first standardized written form of the Greenlandic language. It became a foundational cultural element.
But the religious mission soon merged with the crown's economic interests.
Yes, the zeal paved the way for control. And that control crystallized in 1774 with the creation of the Royal Greenland Trading Company.
This wasn't just some business.
No, the Royal Greenland Trading Company was the infrastructure of Danish control. It established an absolute total monopoly on all trade with Greenland.
For how long?
Over 2 centuries. No foreign ships, no private traders, no competition of any kind was allowed.
Now, the Danish government had an official justification for this, a sort of benevolent reason.
They did. They claimed they were protecting the Inuit from the typical colonial exploitation, from those unscrupulous traders that had devastated indigenous populations in other parts of the world.
And to be fair, did it work?
In that one specific way, yes. Greenland largely avoided the mass enslavement, the smallpox blankets, the deliberate extermination campaigns that you see in the Americas. But the mechanism of protection was also the mechanism of profound economic stagnation.
It kept Greenland economically frozen. What were the actual consequences of that policy?
Total dependency. Greenlanders were forbidden from trading internationally, even with Inuit populations in what's now Canada. They were prevented from developing their own businesses, like shipping or processing.
All the decisions came from Copenhagen.
Every single one. From the price of a seal pelt to the introduction of new tools. It was relentlessly paternalistic.
Danes held all the positions of authority administrators, teachers, doctors.
And the goal wasn't to develop a capable, self-governing society. The goal was this gradual civilizing process that kept the Greenlandic population entirely reliant on Danish expertise and resources.
And the stability of that system is just remarkable. It lasted for over 200 years, keeping Greenland a closed, controlled society.
The world just saw it as an insignificant remote outpost. But that profound indifference was violently shattered when the Second World War came to Europe.
So that bubble bursts abruptly, April 1940.
Right. Nazi Germany invades Denmark, and the government surrenders within hours.
And just like that, Greenland, halfway across the world, is politically orphaned.
It had no government, no central authority. No one had any idea who was really in charge.
And this political void leads to this incredible act of wartime defiance.
It really is. The Danish governors who are still in Greenland, along with the head of the trading company, they make this extraordinary decision. They refuse the authority of the now occupied Danish government in Copenhagen.
They essentially declare Greenland free from the Nazi-controlled motherland.
And the diplomatic key to that survival was a man named Henrik Kaufmann.
The Danish ambassador to the United States, he became a kind of one-man government in exile.
He did, acting with absolutely no legal mandate from his home country. His actions were technically treason against the occupied regime, but they were absolutely critical for the Allies.
Kaufmann negotiates a deal with Washington.
He does. He gives the U.S. government permission to establish military bases in Greenland in exchange for protection from a potential German invasion.
And the timing here is so important for understanding this geopolitical pivot. This deal was signed in April 1941.
Which is 8 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor.
So the U.S. established a military presence in the Arctic before it was even officially at war with the Axis powers.
And the U.S. didn't do this out of altruism. They did it because Greenland, once considered worthless, had suddenly become strategically essential. It all comes down to geography.
The Great Circle Route.
Exactly. If you stretch a string between New York and London on a globe, the shortest path arcs right over the southern tip of Greenland.
Which made it a vital refueling station, but its value went way deeper than that.
Much deeper. It revolved around 2 crucial wartime functions. The first, and maybe the most overlooked, was weather forecasting.
Right, because storms move from west to east.
Exactly. The vast majority of major storm systems form over North America and move east across the Atlantic. Controlling Greenland meant the Allies could track these systems days before they hit Europe.
That's a massive intelligence advantage. It lets you time bombing raids, naval movements.
And the greatest amphibious invasion in history?
D-Day.
The weather data from Greenland was absolutely vital for planning D-Day. When bad weather threatened to push the invasion back for weeks, Eisenhower relied heavily on those Arctic forecasts to pinpoint the small, temporary window of clear weather they needed for the Normandy landings.
And the second function was the Battle of the Atlantic.
German U-boats were just devastating Allied shipping. They were close to crippling Britain.
Because of the mid-Atlantic gap.
Right, this huge swath of ocean that was too far from either North America or Europe for patrol aircraft to cover. It was a U-boat hunting ground where convoys were completely exposed.
And Greenland bridged that gap.
Perfectly. Patrol planes flying from bases in Greenland could cover that critical zone. They could spot U-boats, coordinate destroyer attacks, provide air cover. It was decisive in finally turning the tide against the German submarine threat.
The Germans, of course, they realized this advantage and tried to neutralize it, which leads to this bizarre, forgotten chapter of the war.
The Secret War on the Ice. It sounds like a movie title.
It really does.
Germany started setting up these covert weather stations on the extremely remote east coast of Greenland. They'd land small teams, set up sophisticated radio gear, and transmit vital weather data back to Germany.
And these weren't met by regular army units. They were met by the Danish sledge patrol.
Correct. The sledge patrol was just a handful of Danish hunters and local Inuit guides, patrolling thousands of miles of isolated coastline on dog sleds.
Their mission was literally to hunt down and neutralize these German secret stations.
And it led to genuine, lethal conflict. Shootouts and firefights in the absolute middle of nowhere, surrounded by glaciers and icebergs.
It's just an incredible image.
The courage of those small patrols can't be overstated. They were fighting a shadow war in sub-zero temperatures, hundreds of miles from anything. Their success ensured the Allies kept their weather advantage.
So as the war ends, the American bases stay. The alliance is cemented. But as the conflict shifts from a hot war to a cold war, Greenland's strategic importance doesn't just continue.
It becomes existential.
So if World War II made Greenland a vital link, the Cold War put it right at ground zero.
It really did. The shortest, most practical route for a nuclear exchange between the superpowers Moscow to New York goes directly over the North Pole,
putting Greenland squarely underneath the flight path of bombers and missiles.
This terrifying reality drove massive American investment. In 1951, the U.S. and Denmark signed a defense agreement that allowed for these huge military installations. The most famous, of course, is Thule Air Base.
Now called Pawtucket Space Base.
Right, and Thule was truly the front line of nuclear war. In the 50s and 60s, its primary function was multifaceted.
It was a staging area for bombers first, right?
Initially, yes. A crucial refueling and staging area for B-52s, making sure they could reach targets deep inside the Soviet Union. But later, its main role shifted to early warning systems.
Massive radar installation.
Exactly. Designed to detect incoming Soviet ICBMs the very first moment they appeared over the horizon.
So if World War III had broken out, Thule would have been the first to know, and probably the first to be hit.
Without a doubt. But Thule, you could see it. The real, truly mind-bending secret was hidden a few years later.
Camp Century.
Camp Century, established in 1959. It's one of the most audacious, almost unbelievable military projects ever conceived.
Officially, it was a scientific research station.
Officially. In reality, it was a fully functional nuclear-powered military base. A small city built entirely beneath the surface of the continental ice sheet.
A city under the ice. It sounds like science fiction. What was the scale of this thing?
It was immense. We're talking about a network of tunnels about 3,000 feet long, dug right into the ice. It had barracks, a recreation hall, a laundry, supply depots, power generation.
All for how many people?
It was designed to support up to 200 soldiers and scientists, all hidden 8 meters, about 26 feet below the surface, completely invisible to Soviet satellites.
And how on earth did the Army Corps of Engineers build tunnels in flowing ice?
They developed a whole new engineering technique for it. They called it cut and cover.
Cut and cover.
They used these massive rotary snow mills to dig deep trenches in the ice. Then they installed huge, arched metal structures inside the trenches to form the ceilings, and then they just let the snow fall and bury the whole thing deeper and deeper over time.
But they did do real science there.
Oh, absolutely. The ice cores from Camp Century are legendary. They gave scientists this crucial data, letting them literally read the chemical history of Earth's atmosphere locked in the ice. It revolutionized our understanding of past climates.
But the science, as fascinating as it was just a cover.
A cover for the true, highly classified purpose. Project Iceworm.
Project Iceworm. This is where it gets terrifying.
This was the plan to deploy hundreds of nuclear missiles under the Greenland ice sheet. And the ambition was just staggering.
Explain the scope of Iceworm. What were they really trying to build?
The plan envisioned thousands of kilometers of interconnected tunnels. Some sources compare the proposed area to the size of a U.S. state, like Alabama, all designed to hold rail-mobile nuclear missiles.
So the missiles would be constantly moving.
constantly moving along this vast subterranean rail network.
Hmm.
The Soviets would never be able to target them effectively. It was designed to guarantee a devastating second strike capability.
And Camp Century was the proof of concept. It showed you could sustain a population under the ice, powered by its own portable nuclear reactor. So why did they stop? What went wrong?
The planners, as brilliant as they were, they forgot one crucial principle of glaciology.
The ice moves.
The Greenland ice sheet is not a static block of ice. It is a slow-motion continental scale glacier. It flows, it creeps inexorably towards the coast.
And nature started fighting back.
Precisely. The flow of the ice, this slow but irresistible force, it began crushing the base almost immediately. Within 5 years, the immense pressure had started deforming the infrastructure.
Tunnels buckled, walls compressed.
Metal doorways twisted out of shape. The cost and the danger just became too great.
So by 1967, Project Iceworm is canceled, and Camp Century is abandoned. What happened to it all?
It was just left there. The military took the personnel out. They removed the core of the portable nuclear reactor itself, but they made this devastating assumption about the rest of it.
They assumed the snow would just bury it forever.
Forever, they thought it would never be an issue for the rest of time.
And what exactly did they leave behind in the ice?
Everything else, the entire infrastructure. Tens of thousands of gallons of diesel fuel, massive tanks of sewage, tons of Cold War equipment, and crucially, a huge amount of chemical waste, including highly toxic PCBs.
Which are notoriously persistent pollutants.
Exactly. So now the world's defining crisis, climate change, is creating a very literal climate time bomb.
The melt rates are accelerating.
Dramatically. Projections now suggest that the specific area where Camp Century lies will start experiencing net ice loss, more melt than accumulation, within the next 50 to 75 years.
Meaning all that Cold War waste, the diesel, the sewage, the PCBs could be exposed and start leaching directly into the marine environment.
And this creates an immediate, highly charged political dispute. Denmark, as the sovereign power, says the U.S. made the mess and should clean it up. The U.S. maintains that since it's on Danish territory, Denmark is ultimately responsible.
And while they argue, the ice melts.
Right, but the fallout wasn't just environmental. When the truth about Project Iceworm came out, it caused a massive political scandal.
Because the Danish government knew about it.
They knew about it and the nuclear material on their territory, but they deliberately kept it secret from their own parliament. When the truth emerged in the 90s, it triggered a crisis. It revealed that Denmark had violated its own nuclear-free policy.
And for Greenlanders, this must have been the deepest betrayal of all.
It was. Their land was used as the front line for a secret nuclear weapons program, putting their safety at risk without any consultation or consent. This revelation just injected enormous resentment into the relationship with Denmark and supercharged the push for full autonomy. The Cold War secrets really brought those simmering colonial resentments to a boil. I mean, for centuries, Greenlanders had been governed by others.
By the trading monopoly, by those paternalistic administrators. And even after 1953, when Greenland officially went from being a colony to being a county of Denmark.
Right. That 1953 reform was supposed to be the first step toward modernization. It offered theoretical equality representation in the Danish parliament.
But it was equality in theory only.
In practice, Denmark maintained total control. Danish citizens filled all the major leadership roles. And this period kicked off the aggressive development policies of the 50s and 60s.
Driven by this Danish belief that traditional Inuit culture was backward
and needed to be rapidly modernized and westernized. And the consequences of this forced modernization were culturally devastating.
What specific policies caused such deep, lasting trauma?
There were a few. First, a massive relocation drive. It forced people to move from small traditional settlements into larger centralized towns, breaking up family and community structures that had sustained them for millennia.
And traditional hunting was discouraged.
Actively discouraged in favor of commercial fishing, which was mostly run by Danish companies.
And then there were the policies that targeted the youth, creating what many called the lost generation.
That's right. And this was maybe the most traumatic policy. Small numbers of Greenlandic children were intentionally taken from their families and flown to Denmark.
To be educated in Danish language and culture, to become a new elite.
Exactly. But when they returned, they were caught between worlds. They couldn't fully participate in traditional Inuit culture, but they were still seen as outsiders by the Danish community.
That rapid, forced cultural transition happening over maybe 2 generations, it created this immense social dislocation, an identity crisis.
And that trauma, is the root of so many of the severe social problems Greenland openly acknowledges today.
The high rates of alcoholism, domestic violence.
And the suicide rate among young men, which is tragically one of the highest in the world. This is the enduring legacy of being told your culture is inadequate and being forced into a system that didn't fully accept you.
And out of that pain, the autonomy movement really gained momentum in the 60s and 70s.
Yes, fueled by this feeling that only local control could fix local problems. This political awakening culminated in the 1979 referendum,
Which established home rule.
the first major step away from dependency. It granted Greenland control over most internal affairs, education, health, social services, local taxes.
But Denmark kept control over the big stuff. Defense, foreign affairs, money, and justice. And, critically, the subsidy.
That's the autonomy ceiling. Despite running their own schools and hospitals, the economy remained fundamentally reliant on the Danish subsidy. It covered roughly half the national budget.
You can't be truly free if someone else pays your bills.
Exactly. And that ceiling was finally challenged by the expanded self-rule agreement in 2009. This was the turning point that truly set Greenland on the path to potential statehood.
It was a huge legal and symbolic shift.
Massive. The new act formally recognized Greenlanders as a distinct people under international law with an inherent right to independence. Greenlandic became the sole official language, and most importantly,
They gained control of their own natural resources.
that is the entire key. The engine of future independence, and what's under the ice is what's driving all this geopolitical interest.
Geological surveys have confirmed huge potential deposits.
Huge deposits of iron ore, zinc, copper, offshore oil and gas, and most critically, rare earth elements, Re and uranium.
And rare earths are the foundational ingredients for modern tech. Electric vehicles, advanced defense systems.
Everything. They're vital for the powerful magnets used in wind turbines and smartphones. So the path to independence is now explicitly laid out. Achieve economic self-sufficiency by developing these resources, replace the Danish subsidy, and then hold a referendum for full sovereignty.
Which brings us back to that profound irony, the devil's bargain.
The very thing that threatens to destabilize global society, the warming climate, is exposing the mineral wealth that could fund Greenland's deepest national aspiration: freedom.
It creates this almost impossible political and moral calculus for Greenlandic leaders.
It does. They have to weigh the environmental risks of massive-scale mining, which contributes to global climate change, against the generations-old desire for genuine self-determination.
So let's just confront the scale of this, because the melting ice sheet isn't just a local story. It's transforming the future of the entire planet. The ice sheet isn't just shrinking slowly.
No, in geological terms, it's collapsing. The numbers are staggering and they're accelerating.
Over the last couple of decades, what's the average loss?
The average loss is about 270 billion tons of ice per year. In particularly warm years of 2019, that loss was over 500 billion tons.
And this is happening faster than the models predicted.
Significantly faster than even the pessimistic climate models predicted 15 years ago.
And to help people visualize this scale, the entire Greenland ice sheet holds enough frozen water to raise global sea levels by, 7 meters?
7 meters, which is about 23 feet.
That is the ultimate existential threat.
And while it would take centuries to melt completely, even a fraction of that is catastrophic.
A 3-foot sea level rise, which is now considered highly likely by 2100, would displace hundreds of millions of people. It would inundate coastal cities from Miami to London to Shanghai.
And Greenland isn't just a future threat, it's a current active contributor.
Right. It contributes about 20% of the world's current sea level rise, and that percentage is increasing rapidly. The scientific community has identified a crucial tipping point.
If global temperatures go past 2 degrees Celsius,
Then significant, sustained, and irreversible melting of the Greenland ice sheet becomes locked in for the long term, regardless of what we do about emissions in the future. But the local consequences for Greenlanders are this bizarre duality of threat and opportunity.
it's so complex. For southern Greenland, the warming brings an agricultural opportunity that hasn't existed since the medieval warm period.
Winters are shorter, growing season is longer.
Up to 3 weeks longer. Farmers who once struggled to grow potatoes can now successfully cultivate vegetables, grains, even sheep forage.
But for the majority of the population who rely on the sea and the ice, this change is devastating.
It is an existential threat to their cultural survival. Traditional hunting is entirely dependent on the stability of the sea ice.
The ice used to be predictable.
It used to arrive reliably in November. Now it might not form until January. It breaks up earlier in the spring. This unpredictability means that the traditional knowledge passed down through thousands of years, where to find seals, which ice is safe, is quickly becoming obsolete.
And that forces a severe crisis of identity, especially for younger Greenlanders trying to maintain a connection to traditions that the environment no longer supports.
And this rapidly changing environment is, of course, what's fueling the geopolitical resource rush. The melting ice is exposing the mineral reserves the world urgently needs,
Uranium, zinc, and those critical rare earth elements.
which immediately shifts Greenland's strategic importance again. It's transformed from a military defense platform to a resource control hub, and the global powers are circling.
Who is most interested?
The interest is enormous. China has aggressively pursued investment in potential mining prospects. European consortiums are deeply interested in diversifying their supply chains.
And this all leads us back to that audacious political move in 2019, the reported discussion in the U.S. about purchasing Greenland.
It sounds absurdly imperialistic, but it wasn't without precedent. The U.S. actually offered $100 million for Greenland back in 1946.
And though the recent discussions were rejected outright, Greenland is famously not for sale, it just underscores how important global powers now view the island's territory and resources.
For Greenlanders, this is a genuine double-edged sword. It offers massive potential funding for independence, but they also risk becoming mere pawns in great power competition, just like they were during the Cold War.
So stepping back from all that, let's look at daily life in modern Greenland. The population is just 58,000 residents.
Right. And it's this striking juxtaposition of a modern, subsidized welfare state against an overwhelming, extreme wilderness.
The safety net is profound, funded by that annual Danish block grant.
Universal health care, free higher education, subsidized housing. It ensures a baseline quality of life. But the logistics are astronomical.
Yeah.
The cost of living is one of the highest in the world because almost everything has to be imported.
That infamous $10 head of lettuce, it's a real thing.
It's a daily reality, and compounding that is the sheer isolation. There are virtually no roads connecting the towns.
The island is larger than Mexico, but to get from the capital, Nuuk, to another settlement, you have to fly or take a boat.
Your only options are highly subsidized planes, helicopters, or coastal ferries. The infrastructure costs are crippling.
So economically, what keeps the country afloat, besides the subsidy?
Fishing is the undisputed backbone. Mostly deep-sea shrimp, halibut, and cod. They have a massive, modernized fishing fleet, and they process the catch locally, which generates a healthy trade surplus.
And tourism is the growing secondary industry.
Rapidly growing, attracting visitors drawn to the last great wilderness. The glaciers, the northern lights, the sheer scale of it all.
The persistence of traditional subsistence hunting is what really defines the culture.
Absolutely. Hunting seals, whales, muskox, and caribou. It isn't just about food. It is central to the national and cultural identity.
The preparation of matak, the mastery of dog sledding.
These are the skills and practices that define what it means to be Kalatit or Greenlandic. They represent a cultural continuity stretching back 4 millennia.
But these cultural strengths exist in tension with some really significant internal crises, which are openly discussed by Greenland's own government.
The statistics are heartbreaking. We come back to those high rates of alcoholism, domestic violence, and the tragically high suicide rate.
And the roots are in that traumatic, forced cultural transition of the mid-20th century.
The separation from tradition, coupled with limited economic opportunities, it creates immense psychological distress, especially during the long, dark winters.
The response to this social crisis has been focused on cultural revitalization.
That's the core strategy, a massive effort to reinforce the Greenlandic language, to teach traditional skills in schools, to reconnect youth with the wisdom of their elders. The belief is that a strong cultural identity is the only way to counteract the damage of colonization.
Which brings us finally back to the independence debate. The consensus is clear. Most Greenlanders want independence.
Eventually, the timing is the only open question.
And the barrier is always the same.
Economic sustainability. They need to find a way to replace that 5 billion kroner annual block grant from Denmark, which is roughly $725 million USD, the subsidy that pays for half the government budget.
So can mining fill that gap?
Mining revenue is the highest probability path, specifically from rare earth elements. But developing those mines requires massive foreign investment, navigating intense environmental politics, and it takes years, if not decades, before the revenue can reliably replace the Danish subsidy.
What are the other options on the table?
Expanding high-end, low-impact tourism is critical. They're also looking at strategic positioning, maybe charging fees for access to new Arctic shipping lanes, or hosting more research hubs or military facilities in exchange for direct payments.
But regardless of the path, most analysts agree that true economic independence is at least a generation away.
It is. But the conversation about what kind of country Greenland will be, whether it prioritizes cultural preservation over rapid industrial development, that conversation is happening right now.
In this sense, Greenland has become a kind of laboratory.
A laboratory for some of the most critical, universal questions facing the world today. How does a tiny indigenous culture survive in a globalized world? How do you balance urgent economic development with essential environmental preservation? And how do indigenous peoples successfully reclaim agency after centuries of colonization? #OTRO.
What really resonates most profoundly throughout this whole history is this relentless, brutal power of adaptation contrasted with the catastrophic failure of cultural rigidity.
That contrast is the central moral of the Arctic story. The Inuit survived for 4,000 years, precisely because they constantly adapted. Their practices, their technology, their knowledge, it was all fluid.
And the Norse failed because they were rigid. They insisted on clinging to a European farming identity, to customs and religious practices that the Greenland environment just could not support.
Even when the climate was favorable, they famously preferred to starve while maintaining their cultural norms rather than adopt the superior hunting and survival technologies of the Inuit right next door.
And this historical lesson, written in ice, is the crucial challenge facing the entire globe today. We are all in an experiment to see if modern civilization can adapt to a changing climate.
Or if we'll cling to our current economic and cultural rigidities until the environment collapses around us.
Modern Greenlanders are the inheritors of both of those legacies, the adaptable Inuit, but also a colonial system that violently forced them into European rigidity.
And now they're caught in a global system that desperately needs to adapt, but seems fundamentally incapable of doing it quickly enough.
Greenland's story is the world's story, just magnified by the forces of the Arctic. It matters not just for its minerals, but because the fate of that ice sheet affects every single coastal city on Earth.
What happens at the top of the world doesn't stay there. The meltwater truly reaches every shore.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, the next time you see that massive, cold, white shape on a world map?
Remember the millennia of human history written in its ice. Remember the ingenious Saqqaq hunters. Remember Erik the Red's audacious, brilliant lie about a Greenland designed to lure hopeful settlers.
Remember the Norse farmers who slowly starved, clinging to their European identity?
Remember the treacherous geopolitical calculation that placed Camp Century, a hidden city with a nuclear reactor, beneath the surface. And remember the courageous sledge patrol fighting Nazis amid the icebergs.
And remember the social scars rooted in forced modernization and the determined politicians today debating how to achieve their nationhood, funded by the mineral wealth exposed by the melting ice.
The history isn't static. It is moving, physically moving, as the ice flows and collapses. Greenland's immense challenges are a profound forecast of our own planetary future. Thank you for diving deep with us today.